Hi, everybody. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar from the Community Access, Reach, and Engagement Committee of the Society for Conservation Biology North America. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anna Weber. I'm the chair of the CARE Committee and the Diversity Officer for the Society for Conservation Biology North America. Today, we're really excited to be hosting a webinar with the National Wildlife Federation on bipartisanship and conservation. Before we get started on that, though, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what our organization is for anybody who may be unfamiliar. So Society for Conservation Biology North America is a regional group of the broader global Society for Conservation Biology. We're a professional society dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. Our vision is of a world with thriving biodiversity, ecosystems, and human connections. And our mission is to provide an environment that welcomes, supports, and empowers diverse students and professionals to contribute, advance, and apply conservation science. So to summarize all of that, we're a really broad organization with members of all backgrounds and from all career paths within the conservation field, including biologists, social scientists, conservation managers, government agency employees, really anything related to conservation. For our members, we host networking and professional development events like this one. And we hold conferences in North America every 2 years, with the next one being in this summer in Milwaukee. And the Global Society also produces 3 publications that members can subscribe to keep up to date on research and conservation news. So this webinar series, you can scan the QR code if you'd like to get more information. I think Bernie will probably also be posting links for these in the chat. Okay, so this webinar has been organized, as I mentioned earlier, by SCBNA's new CARE Committee. We work to build a safe and supportive community within SCBNA where all are welcome to come together in a common goal of supporting conservation in North America. We're really focused on member engagement, community building, and improving accessibility and inclusivity within our organization, and also within the broader conservation field. We host webinars like this one, and we develop online resources to help support our members. Some members of our committee have also been involved in developing an allyship program, which comprises a series of educational videos and also a classroom curriculum that will be available for use to teach mostly undergraduate students about allyship. We have a committee that is little but mighty, but if you're interested in being involved, you can send me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat. So I'm just going to briefly plug a couple of the resources that we've been working on before I introduce our speakers. First of all, over the last year or two, we've been crowdsourcing a compilation of diversity-related and legal resources, including a lot of articles and websites where you can go to learn about diversity issues, how to navigate federal policies, for instance, in scientific grant writing, where there's some limitations on the type of language that can be used these days. We have job boards, resources for job seekers, guidance for how to communicate with the public and the media, and how to contact your congresspeople. And there are also a few legal resources on there available that are related to environmental policy and as well as immigration issues. So the list of resources is still in development. If you log on, if you have a look and you see something that we're missing, there's also a link on that webpage where you can submit new resources to add to the list. We have also been working to crowdsource a list of opportunities for students that are not dependent on federal funding, given the uncertainties around support for science and academia in the US right now. We are looking for opportunities to add to our list that include scholarships, assistantships, fellowships for graduates and postdocs, research opportunities for undergrads, internships, grant opportunities. Anybody can list an opportunity through the Google form, which is the top QR code there, and you can view the list at the lower QR code. The list is very much in need of updating and in need of more listings on it. So if you know of an opportunity that might fit this bill, please feel free to add it to our list. The more people who contribute to it, the more useful this document will be. And at this point, I am very excited to introduce today's webinar on bipartisanship and conservation. It's a very important topic that I think has been on a lot of our minds lately. Our speakers are joining us from the National Wildlife Federation, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to unite all Americans to ensure wildlife and people thrive in a rapidly changing world. They engage in conservation efforts, grassroots actions, and create educational content and publications, including Ranger Rick, which is how I personally was introduced to the National Wildlife Federation as a child. So I'm happy to introduce our speakers now. Jill Feldhusen, Senior Manager of Wildlife Policy, and there we go, sorry, and Ross Griffin, the Associate Vice President of Government Affairs. And from here, I am excited to turn it over to Ross and Jill so they can introduce themselves and impart some of their wisdom from their work with the National Wildlife Federation.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everybody for joining. I think we'll introduce ourselves and then we'll get over to our slideshow to share screen. My name is Ross Griffin. Like Anna said, I'm the Associate Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Wildlife Federation. If you are not old Ranger Rick fans and you're unfamiliar, the National Wildlife Federation was founded in 1936 by a cartoonist named Ding Darling, who was very close with Franklin Roosevelt and was a big wildlife advocate. We exist today to help unite a broad tent view of outdoor and wildlife enthusiasts, such as hunters, anglers, hikers, climbers, birders, photographers, you name it. We include everyone, including gardeners, which Naomi will make sure I include, to help make sure that wildlife and people can thrive in a rapidly changing world. So this means we engage across a lot of policy areas, climate and energy policy, hunting and angling policy, public lands management policy, water, etc. We'll touch on a few of those today. But we do everything with a science-based point of view. We employ a number of scientists, one of whom is on the call today, Naomi, but a whole team of very talented biologists to help make sure that all of our policy positions are rooted in facts and science. And that helps make us a trusted voice on Capitol Hill with members of Congress from both parties. That also informs all of our policy advocacy, is the recognition that the most successful and durable policies are bipartisan policies. So we work very hard to make sure that we do have support on both sides of the aisle wherever possible, whenever we're pushing forward priorities. So our presentation today, we'll talk about bipartisan opportunities or the potentials, some potential items for bipartisan success in a Congress that right now I'd say has an overwhelmingly negative narrative for issues of conservation or biodiversity related policy. So these are things that we still see hope keep us coming to work every day. We still see hope that these can get done. They have bipartisan support, and we'll talk a little bit about what they are, why they gain bipartisan support as best we can tell, and how we've endeavored to help cultivate that support. So I'll turn things over to Jill to let her introduce herself, and then Jill, after the intro, I'll get the slideshow started and we can get into it.
Awesome. Thank you, Ross. And hello, everyone. My name is Jill Feldhusen, and I am NWF's Senior Manager of Federal Wildlife Policy. And I have been at NWF for a very fun 8 years. And I actually came to NWF to work on one of the topics we're covering today, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And, so since then, I've worked on more of our federal wildlife policy initiatives. And just a quick aside on my background. I grew up in Idaho in a farming and ranching family, went to school at the University of Montana and studied political science, and then had the privilege of working for Montana Audubon during a state legislative session where I learned so much and was really the first time I got to put any of my theoretical political science into practice. And then I also had the privilege of working for one of the National Wildlife Federation's affiliate organizations, the Montana Wildlife Federation, where my job was to organize sportsmen and women around climate change. And this is a very fun throwback. It was during the Clean Power Plan under the Obama administration. So trying to connect hunters and anglers in Montana and grow support with them for a federal climate program. And so fun job. But I think all of this has really fed in, like just being in the West, living in the West, my experience working with different constituencies has really fed into the theme of this, where I think in a lot of places, if you want to make a huge difference and you want lasting impact with initiatives, I've just like seen the value of talking to people and trying to convince people and bringing them on board with things. It takes longer, but I have fully drunk the Kool-Aid on this approach, and I'm very excited to work at an organization that has a similar worldview. And so, a little bit about me, and I will dive right into the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Thank you, Ross, for the PowerPoint help.
Yes, just let me know when you need a slide changed.
Awesome. Maybe the next one, slide 2. Oh,
Uh-oh.
a lot
There
of
we go.
meetings. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. So Recovering America's Wildlife Act, I don't know how familiar this group is with it. I will be pretty brief because I know it's not to dive into the specifics of the policy. But we all know, and especially this group of scientists knows, that there is a wildlife crisis facing our nation. More than 1/3 of species are considered at risk. More than 40 states and territories just went through a process of revising and updated their wildlife action plans. And there's an estimated 14,000 species now that states and territories have identified as species of greatest conservation need, which is up from the 12,000 that was identified a decade ago. So that number continues to grow. And I think we all see this in our day-to-day lives. However, at the same time, state fish and wildlife agencies are still largely funded by hunting and fishing revenue, which leaves a lot of species underfunded or not funded at all. And on top of that, the current system of funding is often largely reactive, where there's funding for the hunted and fish species, and then all of a sudden it looks like a species is in decline and headed towards potentially a federal ESA listing. And then, of course, a ton of species or funding is thrown at it to try to keep it from getting to that point. But overall, it's a system that leaves a lot of species in the middle of not getting the attention they need, and not giving, scientists the resources they need to even attempt to proactively conserve fish and wildlife. And I will say in this latest round of state wildlife action plans, states have started also just identifying species of greatest information need. So there's just so little funding. Sometimes a state doesn't even know, is a species in decline, or do we just not have the resources to even really know where its populations are? And so just a big gap in how we fund and do wildlife conservation in the US. And so, Ross, if we could go to the next slide. That is where Recovering America's Wildlife Act comes in. This bill aims to address this problem by annually dedicating up to 1.4 billion a year in funding. So specifically, it would create up to 1.3 billion for state fish and wildlife agencies to fund the implementation of their congressionally mandated state wildlife action plans. Right now, state agencies estimate that Congress gives them less than 5% of what is needed to actually implement these really thorough, robust plans that they, ask states to produce. So it is attempting to address that gap. And then it also has just historic implications for federally recognized tribal nations. It includes 97.5 million in federal funding for federally recognized tribal nations. I think it's an underappreciated point in conservation sometimes that federally recognized tribes don't receive any guaranteed stream of federal funding for fish and wildlife conservation. There's a sustained tribal wildlife grant program currently, and states get a formula amount, whatever Congress appropriates, whereas our nation's 574 federally recognized tribes are competing for grants for that same type of program. The total program is funded between 5 and 8 million a year. So it's just a huge gap. And so finally giving dedicated funding to tribal nations is just a massive piece of Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And then finally, it also creates a temporary pool of federal funding to support the recovery of species already listed under the Endangered Species Act. So it's trying to tackle all of the different problems at the various levels for fish and wildlife conservation. And it is massive. If and when this bill passes, it will be the largest investment in fish and wildlife conservation in decades. It is a bill that it aims to meet the magnitude of the challenges facing fish and wildlife. And because of that, it is why, we have been very intentional and careful with the way that we have crafted the legislation and then also, built the campaign around it to try to maximize our attempt at success. It's been a while since Congress has invested in wildlife in a meaningful way, and so it takes a lot of people rowing in the same direction to actually get it across the finish line. And I'm happy to dive into some of that next, Ross, at the next slide. Awesome. Okay. So the idea of dedicated funding for fish and wildlife conservation actually was born out of a blue ribbon panel that the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies convened in 2015. And this was chaired by a bipartisan group of governors, and then it included a ton of different representatives, included conservation organizations, included the outdoor industry, it included oil and gas company interests. It was just a bunch of people in a room trying to figure out how can we address the crisis facing our nation's fish and wildlife. And what they landed on was dedicated funding, and what eventually became the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. But I think that is important largely because it set a foundation for the bill of bringing together disparate interests, people that you wouldn't often think of working together at the same table, trying to come up with a solution for fish and wildlife. So I think that was an important moment for the campaign and really helped set the course that we are still on largely in a lot of ways. And so the bill was first introduced in the 114th Congress, which I was looking at, that was a decade ago, which makes me feel a little tired, but also optimistic. And it was introduced by Congresswoman Dingell, who is a Democrat from Michigan, and Fortenberry, who is no longer in Congress, but he was a Republican from Nebraska. And that alone, I just want to point out that, we could have introduced recovering with just Representative Dingell early on and, just had a Democrat bill. But because a goal has always been bipartisanship and making sure that we're bringing people along, it takes time to cultivate those champions, but that was worth doing. And so it had a bipartisan introduction. And in the first iteration of recovering, it did not have the tribal title. It was funded by oil and gas. It was a very different bill than what we have today. But that also sort of feeds into our legislative strategy and our coalition building and just the aim of bipartisanship. Once the bill was introduced in the 114th Congress, we started hearing from tribal nations that, hey, if you're funding states and tribes, we should also be getting funding for the fish and wildlife conservation on our lands and waters. And so, that took time to work with our tribal coalition and our tribal partners to draft a tribal title that actually meets the needs of tribal nations. And so, that took a lot of time and a lot of work. And then you have to go back to other core partners and let them know what's going on. But then in the next 116th or 15th Congress, the bill was introduced with the tribal title. And then all of a sudden we have a larger coalition that is working to move the bill forward. And that includes, there are now hundreds of tribal nations that have written or passed resolutions in support of Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and that we now work hand in hand with on trying to pass the legislation. And so that is part of just our goal of sustained legislative momentum, and that is challenging. Our goal has always been we've introduced the bill every Congress since the 114th, and it's always to just try to get it a little further each time. And sometimes that takes growing the coalition, building out legislative champions. The bill did not have a Senate companion until after it was introduced in the House for a couple of Congresses, and that's in part because it took us a little bit of time to identify and cultivate a Republican champion, who at the time, Senator Blunt from Missouri, who has since retired. But I think that also speaks to some of the strategy of how we've thought about the bill of, we could have introduced a Democrat-only Senate companion bill. But I think it was always, in our view, worth taking the time to cultivate Republicans along the way to just give the bill some standing power and to make sure that we could keep our coalitions broad, and also keep bringing more Republican and Democratic offices into the fold. So that has been our goal. So yeah, we have made changes to the overall text of the bill, but I think just to go back to the that is always done in the service of keeping our coalition broad, and trying to move the needle further every time. And it is really hard. I am very happy to say that the Society of Conservation Biologists, you all are part of the coalition working on Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It boasts more than 1,900 groups and businesses from across the country. Um, but we have at our international coalition, we have Defenders of Wildlife and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, just partners that often won't be in the same room together, coming together to advocate pretty loudly in support of one bill. And so it takes a lot of time to cultivate that and to build that, and it takes a lot of work to make sure that the language is in a way that works for everyone. But that is something we've always prioritized, and that is one of the reasons we do have a big coalition working on this bill together. And then, as part of that, just growing our bipartisan support in Congress. It's, I think, something that I have learned and sort of seen firsthand is, we're always cultivating and trying to think through, more Republicans that we can be engaging on wildlife conservation issues. But I think it's also equally important to make sure our Democratic champions are also engaged on this, and we do that in a lot of different ways. But it all just takes time to build those relationships and to bring members up to speed on a specific issue. But it's always been worthwhile. And then the last thing I will say is that we do prioritize bipartisanship, but that often is just it's a it's a strategy that has a more longevity long term, but it also means you have to be very adaptable. And so, right now we do not have Recovering America's Wildlife Act introduced this Congress. It is not a very favorable Congress for issues like recovering. And, that is also strategic on our part. We could just have a member introduce recovering, a Democrat only, and, try to, message around that or do something, but that doesn't actually move our needle in the long term of what we're trying to do, and that could alienate some partners along the way. And so, our foundational principles is big coalition, bipartisanship, and that is what we always come back to when we make strategic decisions around the bill and how we want to prioritize things. And sometimes that does mean pumping the brakes on the momentum that we have spent so long building in order, to preserve the underlying principle of what we're trying to accomplish with a bill like Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So that is everything in a nutshell. I've been working on this for a really long time. My colleague Naomi has been working on this for even longer. So I don't know, Naomi, is there anything you want to add to this overall?
I think no, I think you did a great job. I think even in this recent era, we are still hearing Republicans say they are waiting to see the bill introduced and want to make headway on it because they're hearing from their people at home. This is an inside baseball game, but it's very much an back home people members weighing in. It's that double prong that will make a difference. I really see that as critical to this. They hear from a variety of voices and they don't hear opposition, which really makes it move forward.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm happy to answer any questions that maybe at the end, and I will pass it back to Ross to talk about another issue that has gained bipartisan momentum in a tough Congress.
Jill, you have a couple more slides here.
Oh yeah.
They
Oh,
may
wonderful
just be
photos of our
yeah. And here's
of
Naomi.
our there's Naomi. Yeah, so just to go back to our champ strategy, this is an example of one where it was a Valentine's Day thing, and monarchs are obviously a species in decline that are in a lot of state wildlife action plans. And so we sent out an alert to all of the NWF members asking them to sign a Valentine to their member of Congress. And then we hand delivered these butterflies to them, asking them to be their Valentine, I think, Naomi. I can't remember the exact messaging, but it was just a fun, creative way for us to get some attention from members of Congress. I think, Naomi, there's also a photo of you and then Congressman John Lewis. Dingle still has her butterfly pinned in the background of her events. And so that is just like one of the more creative tactics we've employed as part of our champ strategy. And then Ross, I saw if you go over to the next slide, this is Gloria Tom and some of her colleagues at the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this just goes to speak to the coalition work of, when we didn't have a tribal title, we did not have tribes working with us to pass the bill. And then as part of our effort to address that, now we have Gloria Tom, who was the director of the Navajo Nation Fish and Wildlife Department at the time, on Capitol Hill, speaking in front of Congress, testifying in support of the bill. And now we work lockstep with a lot of tribal nations in support of recovering. And so just goes to show the power of trying to build your coalition so you have just more people working with you to pass your legislation. And now, Ross, if you want to talk Ohio River, I think I'm actually done with slides.
No, you're not.
Oh, man. Here's another one. Shoot. This is for our grassroots efforts now. This is we prioritize doing our champ legislative, sort of our inside baseball game, but then, you don't get anything done in Congress without grassroots momentum and people hearing, members of Congress hearing from people in their district that something is important to the people they represent. And so this is a tactic we did, I think, in the last Congress when we were a little stalled out. We had a petition that 16,000 people, 459 people signed, that we delivered to Leader Schumer and House leadership as well, telling them to pass dedicated funding for fish and wildlife. And then, these are people, they've signed the petition, and now we continue to try to figure out ways to engage them on recovering. So our work on this campaign is coalition building. It's that inside ball game piece, but then it's also making sure that we are engaging grassroots activists and delivering that message to Congress as well. Okay, and I am actually done this time. Thank you, Ross.
Thanks, Jill. Before I get started on the Ohio River bill here, I'll just say that recovering is one example of how there's a core of bipartisan members of Congress who understand that and value wildlife and understand how important it is to recover them and prevent extinctions. Jill and Naomi, frankly, have both been at the core of a couple of other successes in this Congress that we could have used in this case, where there's been demonstrated bipartisan support that has either prevented harm to bedrock environmental laws. In the case of a vote just a week or two ago that would have weakened the Endangered Species Act, that actually was postponed due to Republican opposition from a few key members, around a dozen members from New York, New Jersey, and Florida, who spoke up against it in one very particular case because of the members' affinity for sea turtles. So that was another bit of success that I think has been, maybe not covered widely in the national news media because it was a prevented vote rather than a failed vote. But we're considering that a major win this year. Jill has also worked really hard on state and tribal wildlife grant funding that saw an increase in last year's round of federal appropriations. And that's amidst almost an entirely across the board cut for conservation and environmental programs, as well as all kinds of other meddling from the administration with the implementation of appropriations laws and the administration of grant awards and things like that. So that program that also supports state wildlife agencies continues to see bipartisan support, shows that beyond just the affinity for wildlife, there's a strong core in Congress that also just really values and trusts their state wildlife agencies as conservation delivery mechanism. In a lot of cases, more so than federal agencies, and that I think that's a strength here that carries across some of our priorities. And I won't continue to sing Jill's praises here, but I could about crossings. There's a wildlife crossings pilot program that has bipartisan support and a number of bills that promote migration corridors across different types of state, private, federal land. So Recovering America's Wildlife Act is one example of a theme. And I'm setting that up because I'm going to try to expound on another theme that I've noticed, of which the Ohio River Restoration Program Act is an example. And that is that, despite an environment where we're seeing widespread regulatory rollbacks for clean air and clean water and other protections, and despite the recent and very highly public and publicized attempt to sell off federal public lands, I have noticed that members on both sides of the aisle continue to care deeply about the landscapes and the water bodies that are right in their backyard. So if you speak to them, for instance, in the abstract about maintaining a strong Clean Water Act, many conservative members may not be in favor of that. But if you talk to them about protecting the water in the river in their backyard, I think I might mention the White River that runs through Indianapolis in a bit. That tends to get a lot more support. And so we've seen programs that exist to protect particular watersheds continue to get funding when the EPA overall budget continues to get proposed to be slashed. And so we've taken that and created this new proposal that I will stop talking about themes and start talking about the specific here. But here we have a picture of the Ohio River Islands National Wildlife Refuge and someone fishing on the Ohio River there, which myself being from the state of Ohio, I understand that most people don't think of it as a place of natural beauty and don't think of the Ohio River as a place where you can recreate, but it is, and there's proof. Okay, so a little bit about the Ohio River. I am continually astounded. If you can see my cursor here, I grew up around here, and I went to college around here. So I grew up near tributaries of the Ohio River and went to college about 30 minutes from the river itself. In advocating for Ohio River restoration, I've been amazed that I have to educate people about two things. Number one, the Ohio River is not just a river in Ohio. It is a huge waterway with tributaries that stretch into a basin that covers parts of 15 states. And that's what you're looking at here on this slide, with impaired streams outlined in red. So this is the landscape that we have to deal with, that we are proposing a program to restore. The other thing I tell folks as we advocate for this is that the river and its watershed are not in great shape. The map you see here is outlining, like I said, impaired streams. 69% of stream miles within this basin boundary do not meet state water quality standards, and 64% of lake acres in the same geography also fall short of state water quality standards. And so that's due to issues of pollution, largely related to nutrient pollution from runoff, sediment also from runoff, and then a long legacy of extractive industry and industrial pollution in this region. I've been trained not to call this the Rust Belt, but I call it the industrial heartland. But there's a legacy of centuries of industry here that has resulted in PCBs, mercury, and other pollutants that are present in the waterways. Other issues that the river has seen in recent years, there was a 650-mile long harmful algal bloom that would have been largely because of that nutrient pollution I already mentioned. Just in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been, I think, pretty well publicized flooding in Kentucky that's wiped out communities in kind of the low-lying valleys of Appalachia. There are around 11,000 combined sewer overflows within this region each year that adds to the bacterial load in the waterways. There are issues with invasive carp that threaten various parts of this watershed. And in maybe the most highly publicized disaster, there was a train crash. Again, I don't know if you can actually see my mouse on the screen, but right around here in East Palestine, I think about 2 years ago, when a train full of toxic chemicals exploded in eastern Ohio, I think just about 30 miles from the river itself. And of course, with streams much closer than that feed into the river. And that really woke people up to the threat of contamination within this watershed, flowing down the river to places like Cincinnati, to Louisville, to Indiana and Illinois, and then ultimately into the Mississippi and the Gulf. Um, and so that helped alert people to, if you see this logo here, the Ohio River Water Sanitation Commission that monitors water quality, and just the fact that they live next to and depend on this river, which is not doing well, as I said. This region, though, has provided us with some opportunities. If you look to the north here, outside of the basin, there's a lakeshore along Lake Erie. Members of Congress and senators certainly who represent these states in the basin also represent the Great Lakes Basin and are really familiar with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And then to the east, in states like Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, members of Congress who represent those states also represent the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And that bay also has its own EPA restoration program. Both of those are, or the Great Lakes at least, is completely non-regulatory. It focuses on investments in restoration driven by voluntary on-the-ground applications for funding that are approved as part of an action plan. And so that's helped the Great Lakes kind of restore their reputation as a toxic dumping ground fed by a river that caught on fire in the 60s and things like that. And now they're a great place for recreation, and cities like Cleveland and my home state are re-engaging with their waterfront. So there's a positive association even among members who are typically opposed to expanding activity at the EPA. They've learned to live with and love the EPA because of what it does for their states and other basins. And that's benefited us here, as I'll discuss in my next slide. So the legislation we've proposed, and I'm kind of glossing over a lot of work by my colleagues to do coalition building and talk to folks on the ground throughout this region. Over many years, they actually wrote a restoration plan to propose to Congress, and that led to this legislation that I'll talk about here. It's called the Ohio River Restoration Program Act. It was introduced first at the end of the 118th Congress, so in late 2024, by Congressman Morgan McGarvey, who's a Democrat from Louisville, Kentucky, and Congresswoman Erin Houchin, who's a Republican from Southeast Indiana. They actually represent districts right across the Ohio River from each other. And then they were joined when they reintroduced the bill this past year by two senators introducing a Senate version of the bill, and John Fetterman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, and Todd Young, a Republican from Indiana. So what this bill does is heavily inspired by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. It creates a non-regulatory program for Ohio River restoration at the Environmental Protection Agency. That program essentially would create a 5-year action plan that is informed by state, local, tribal stakeholders to plot a path towards what investments can help improve water quality at its most basic level in that basin. We've proposed $350 million per year to be authorized to support this program. And what that funding mostly would do is the program would be authorized to make grants to people who apply. There would be no kind of top-down dictation of what activities need to be done. No landowners will be told what they need to or can't do on their land. But people can apply for grants, educational institutions, community institutions, NGOs, states, municipalities. That's how it's worked with GLRI, and that's how it would work here. They can apply for grants to help support water quality improvements, flood resilience, including an explicit allowance to use natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions, to improve fish and wildlife habitat and control invasive species, and to remediate toxic pollution in the region, among other things, including improving recreational access and doing community outreach to support all these activities. So that is the program in a nutshell. And in addition to working through third parties, the EPA can also transfer funds to, say, the Department of Agriculture, and to funnel funding from this program through existing programs at USDA that help farmers with, say, like edge of field practices that reduce agricultural runoff. And that would let this funding focus those programs on activities that specifically would support waterways in the Ohio River Basin. So that is the bill in a nutshell. I'm going to go to another slide outlining the basin. These are not impaired streams or waterways. These are congressional districts. And this is the political landscape that we have been working with to try to build support for the bill. If you were to count all the districts, the members of the House that are listed on the right here, there are 58 districts that touch a portion of the Ohio River Basin. You can see it's heavily red. There are, I think, 10 Democrats that touch any part of the basin, and only 4 Democrats whose districts actually directly represent part of the riverfront. And you would think, just following traditional narratives, that would make this a difficult place to earn support, but that has not been the case. And I'll say the Senate map is not much different. There's a Democrat in Pennsylvania, 2 Democrats in Illinois, and 2 Democrats in Maryland, and Republicans everywhere else. I will say this has actually played to our advantage in the current congressional makeup. When you point this out to members of Congress who might be skeptical about spending on environmental programs, who might be fiscal conservatives in general, I point out exactly where this money is going and which members are benefiting, and the political calculus changes when people see that it's getting invested in a lot of rural areas. It's getting invested in the Appalachian region, which traditionally suffers from underinvestment. And that has changed the tune of a lot of members that we talked to. If you couple that with, like I said, the familiarity that a lot of members in this region have with the Chesapeake Bay program, the Delaware Basin program, and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, that's made it really easy to sell it as, like, in a lot of cases, members are representing districts that straddle 2 basins, and they may already understand that a lot of their district is getting millions of dollars from the federal government to restore water, and the other part of their district isn't. Or they may have statewide ambitions and understand that 2/3 of their state is not getting the same support that folks along the Great Lakes shoreline are. And so that, again, has made them amenable to kind of spreading the spending to help the majority of their geography and their state benefit from the same kinds of support that the northern parts are, or the eastern parts are. I mentioned East Palestine as something that has helped to kind of create a toxic reputation for the region. That's building on top of if you pay attention to the news and media about Appalachia, as I do, having gone to college there, you may have heard quite a bit about PFAS in the region. There is an infamous, it's now a Chemours facility along the Ohio River in Parkersburg, West Virginia, that got a lot of attention. Was it because of a Mark Ruffalo movie from like 2019 called Dark Waters? And that's a chemical plant that I drive past every time I drive from DC back to my college town, which I don't do as often anymore. But back when Recovering America's Wildlife Act was still young, I was doing quite a bit. That film is centered largely around the Ohio River itself. The East Palestine disaster kind of helped draw a bullseye on that region as a place that suffers from a lot of toxic pollution, and that's not to mention the legacy of acid mine drainage from the many very old coal mines there that predate a lot of environmental protections. This bill has offered members a chance to reverse that narrative and to make investments and show that they are not just addressing the safety issues that led to the East Palestine train crash, but also addressing the lingering effects of a disaster like that. And I'm watching the time here, so I'm going to speed up. But one last thing I'll point to is that as we've educated members about just the breadth of this basin, we've heard stories like we did in bringing Senator Young from Indiana onto the bill. that, they may not care about what seems like a rather distant Ohio River when you live in Indianapolis. But when you start describing that these funds would be spread into tributaries throughout the basin, suddenly Senator Young's staff said, we've been trying to clean up the White River for years, and we haven't been able to do it because we can't get Great Lakes funding to do it. Would this help? We say yes, and that brings them on board. So we've heard stories like that quite a few times that help bring things home for members and shows that if you can talk about the impact of a conservation investment in their home district, it always helps, and it always takes things away from abstract federal spending down to what does this mean for you and your district and the people that you represent. So I ate up a lot of time, I think. I tend to. But that's another example here of another angle that we've worked to find some bipartisan or some hope of bipartisan success here. I will pause, and if my colleagues have anything to expound on, I'll let them. But otherwise, we can move to, I think, an announcement from Naomi and then Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Ross. And thank you for all the personal flavor to that, knowing that you passed these places and that you saw it firsthand is really also a technique we try to really use. We try to bring members of Congress and their staff into the field and see these sites and get interested in it. So that's something. And being able to tell your own story obviously is very, very effective. I don't know if Anna or Bernie is it there's one more slide. I know you were going to do it later, but if we can do it now. Do you have it?
Mhm.
Okay. So I just want to invite you all. I'm going to be at the Milwaukee meeting and I'm giving you a pitch to come to my presentation. We're hosting one on I think it's Thursday morning, July 15th, on working with the faith community to restore native wildlife habitat by planting native plant gardens. It's based on behavior change, a community-based social marketing plan, and we work with hundreds of congregations in the Great Lakes, but also in the Mid-Atlantic, where we're really engaging people of all backgrounds and all faiths to plant native plants to care for creation. And we're going to share lots of great tips about how this is transferable to any other kind of conservation work. But we have found really great results by using this behavior change model to lead people from raising awareness to actually leading to action. So it's a very significant outcome, and we have data to prove it like any good scientist, and we will love you to come and learn about it. We're going to have 4 different speakers, and we hope you'll let your friends know who are going to be at the conference too. We know there's a lot of competition, but come to this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Yeah, just to give a little bit of background, if anyone is unfamiliar, that session sounds amazing, and it is going to be at SCBNA's upcoming conference this summer in July, and that's in Milwaukee from July 12th to July 16th. So hopefully we'll put a link in the chat about that if it's not there already, to get some more information if you're interested in attending, which everybody should, because it's going to be great.